Hello, this is Amin, and this is session 38 of ASP.NET Core tutorial. In this session, we are going to talk about form validation, and also we introduce two attributes, string length and also required attributes. For validating a form, we should do some changes in our controller and also in our model. And it depends on the technique that we use for creating our model. We can add some feature and HTML helper for handling the validating error, or if we use editor for model, it's automatically add the validation error if any validation error happen in the form while we submit the form. First, we should do some changes in the controller, and in the controller, we should check whether model status is valid or not. If model status is valid, we can process the post process. Otherwise, we can send again the model to the view, and then we can see the error and the validation error that we have in the submitted form. And also we can use some attribute in our models, same as required or string length or other attribute that we introduce in further session. Let's flip to Visual Studio and do the validation for edit action method and edit view. This is the project that we have been working so far throughout this tutorial, and I'm going to cast controller and check the edit action method. This is the edit action method, and it has just HTTP get part, and I should add HTTP post to reveal whether the form is valid or not. For this purpose, I just copy this piece of code, and here I change it to HTTP post, and also I need to receive an object of cost as a model. And here I should check whether the model that I receive is valid or not. For this purpose, I use if condition and check whether the model status is valid or not. For this purpose, I use model status and is valid method. It's return a Boolean parameter, and if the form would be valid, this part of code will be process. Otherwise, we go to this part and after the if, and I don't need this part anymore here. And here I just add a comment, and in the further session and in the upcoming session, we're going to talk about CRUD operation, and edit is a part of CRUD operation, which is update. Just I mentioned post process, but here, as I mentioned, I should again pass the model to the view to reveal whether any error we have or not. But how we can validate the form? For validating the form, we need to add some attribute to our model that we use for passing the data, and using in the view. And as you can see in the edit view, I use a cast model. That's why I should add my attributes to cast model. And here you can see the model that I have. First, I want to talk about required attribute. If we want to push the user to enter a value for a field, or we can use a field or a property mandatory, we should use required attribute. Just bear in mind, if you want to use this type of attribute, you should add this namespace to your class, which is data annotation, which is inside system, component model, and data annotations. And here, for example, for amount, I want to make it mandatory, and that's why I use a required attribute. And if I pass the form to the controller with post method, While the amount is empty, the form return the invalid status, and the validation form and model status return false. Let's check this attribute and check whether the form is valid or not. And as I mentioned, inside this view, I use editor for model. That's why I don't need to add any HTML helper to present the error of validation, and it's automatically add the error validation if there is any error inside the submitted form. Let's save the project and make a breakpoint here and run the project to see the result. Project is up and running, and I go to cast edit, and I'm going to edit ID1. And as you can see, I received the information of a static repository here, and this time I removed the value of amount and I passed the form to the controller by pushing the save button to submit it. Here you can see I received the data and the amount is empty. And here you can see the model status is valid is false. It means there is one validation error inside my form. That's why if I pass this part, you can see the post process is not invoked and it's a jump to return view with model. And if I continue, you can see I have some data validation here. The value is invalid, or the value is not valid for date, because if you remember in previous sessions, I add some format string for date. That's why I received two validation error. Let's back to Visual Studio. And this time I run the project and I use cast edit ID1. And here I change the amount, and also I use the format that I use in the cast model and submit the form. And here you can see I receive a true, and if I added some code here to process the update of this model, it would be happen. But as I haven't mentioned here anything, I just stop the processing. Just I want to describe what is the form validation and how we can validate the form. Let me stop this part and talk about other attribute, which is a string length. I just go to the cast controller and I just mark this format string that I don't want to use this format string here. And for comments, I want to add another attribute, which is a string length, and it has several overloaded versions. But the first option that I should use as an integer, it's the maximum length that I can add in the comment box. I use 20. And after that, I have several options, for example, error message or minimum length. I want to limit the comment to receive the comment between 5 to 20 characters. That's why I use minimum length and enter number 5. And let me close the parentheses and save the project. Now I have two data validation, one for amount, which is mandatory and I use required, and one for comment that its length should be between 5 to 20 characters. Let me save the project and run the project once more to check the StringLength attribute as well. Project is up and running, and I go to again to cast edit ID1. And here I use the comment less than 5 characters. For example, just I add pay and save the project. And as you can see, again, the model is invalid because one of the conditions that I set for the form validation is missed. And if I continue, you can see I received the field comment must be started with a minimum length of 5 and maximum length of 20. And also, if I remove all and submit the form, you can see this time it is valid, because if I want to make this field mandatory, I should use required. But when I type in that field and that property, the minimum and maximum string length will apply on property. That's why the empty field is accepted, but if I enter something there, it should be between 5 to 20 characters. And let me continue and check another situation and enter a text more than 20 characters. As you can see, it is stopped me to enter more than 20 characters. And if I submit the form, this time it is valid. But the message that you can see, for example, here and here, if I continue the debugging, you can see some predefined message. I can modify these two messages. And for this purpose, I go again to my project and go to the cause. And here, for example, for required, I can add error message, and here as a string I can add the message that I want. For example, amount property is mandatory. And also for this one I can use again error message, and I can enter comment should be between 5 to 20 characters. Let me save the project and run to the project to see whether these two customized messages will appear if I have any error inside my view. And I go again to cast edit ID for this time 2, and I remove this one, and I add a comment less than 5 characters and submit the form. And this time you can see again I have the predefined message for the amount, but the modified messages appear here. Let me check why the message for amount is not reflected here. I will back to the project and check the error. The reason that I haven't received this error message when I make this field empty is that this field is decimal, and when I remove the amount inside this property, actually the required attribute is not applied on this one because I've received a empty a string, and that's why the validation is not the required. And for example, if I run the project again and go to cast edit id1, and instead of make it empty, enter a word here, and as you know this field should be a decimal value, and save the project, you can see this error message, the value test is not valid for amount, and that's why I haven't received that error. But I can check this one with the comment, and I add the required attribute for comment and make this field empty to see the result. Let's back to Visual Studio, and here I add required as well and check if I make this field empty what message I receive, and then I use my custom message for required attribute validation. Let's run the project again and refresh the page, and this time I make this property empty and submit the form, and you can see the comment field is required. This is the message which is related to required attribute, and I modified this message by error message parameter, and here I add error message and mention comment field is mandatory, and save the project and run the project again and refresh this page, and this time make it this property empty and run the project, and you can see comment field is mandatory message is appear here. This is the way that I can implement the form validation when I use editor for model. But if I create my view with custom elements, same as editor for model or label for model, the way that I create a strongly typed cast view, on that situation for appearing this message, I should use one HTML helper which is HTML.ValidationError. And let's back to Visual Studio to talk about that HTML helper and do these two attributes on the view model that I use for create a strongly typed cast. This is the view that I use for create a strongly typed view. And as you can see, I haven't add any HTML helper for reveal the validation error. And also inside the cast controller, I have post and get HTML helper for these two message. And this time for post, if the model would be valid, I will see the view that I designed for this purpose to see the submitted data. But if the form is not valid, I back to this view and pass the model again to see the error message. But first I use if expression and use model status dot is valid. If the model status would be valid, this part that I designed in previous session will be run. Otherwise, I return the same view and pass model as well. But just bear in mind, in the get part, I pass these two lists for the list view and for the drop-down list that I have. That's why when I resend the data to the view, while I haven't stored these two lists on the submitted data, I will receive an error. Let's prove this fact and run the project and make a breakpoint here. Before describing this fact more, let's back to Visual Studio to see you what data will pass to the post method. As you can see, here is the create a cast view model, and as you can see, I have two lists for category list and also for payment method list. And inside this form, I haven't stored these two lists somewhere in some property. For example, in drop-down list for, I stored the selected item inside the category. That's why the categories and the payment methods would be empty when I submit this form. Let's prove this fact. Go to cast create a strongly typed view, and I submit the form with the predefined information that I have. And here you can see inside the categories, I receive null, and also the payment method is null. That's why if some error happen and some validation error happen, and I pass this data again to the view, I will receive one error. Let's prove this fact again and adding some data validation and some attribute to create cast view model. For example, I want to make comment mandatory by adding required attribute, and also I will add a string length as well, and the maximum character would be 50 and the minimum length would be 5 characters. Let's save the project and run the project to see whether if some error happened what I see in my form. And I go to cast strongly typed view and I remove the comment and submit the form. And here, as expected, when I receive to this condition, I receive false, and I will go here. And as long as I continue this debugging, I receive one error because the drop-down list and also the drop-down list which contain the list of categories and list of payment method, it's empty. That's why I received this unhandled exception error, and that's why I should add these two lists before submitting the form again to see the errors. That's why I use model and the categories. And for receiving categories, I use again this custom list that I created in the get part, and I pass this data to this property, and also I need to fill the payment methods property of model. And for receiving this data, I can use this repository and this method. And let's save the project and run the project, and I will again remove the value of comment to see whether I receive any error message there or not. As expected, project is running, and I go again to a strongly typed view and remove the comment, or I add a message with less than 5 characters and submit the form. And again, of course, I receive false model status value. And if I continue, you can see again the unhandled error because I add the categories and payment methods wrongly inside the if block, and I should move them behind the if block. Let's back to Visual Studio and just move these two line of code here after the if block, because when model is invalid, that part is not launched and I can't pass these to list to the view again. Let's save it and run the project again. Once more, go to cast strongly typed view and remove the comment and create, and I submit the form, and as expected it is false. But the form is launching again, but I haven't received any error message here, but the process inside the if block is not launched as well. The form that I expected to see after the form submission is not launched. It means the validation is working, but I haven't received the message. For revealing the message inside the form that I use custom elements, I should use one HTML helper, which is validation message. And let's back to Visual Studio to add a message to the view. Let me stop the debugging and go to view that I have. And here after the comment, let me find the comments block. And here I use again HTML. And this time I use ValidationMessageFor. And just I need to use lambda expression as well and bind this HTML helper to comment. And also there is some more feature that I can add, but here just I use this one and save the project and run the project again to see whether I can see the message of this one or not. Again, I go to cast strongly typed view, and this time I remove this one and I create it. You can see I received the validation error that I expected. The comment field is required, or I add a value less than the string length that I applied to this property. And again, you can see the field comment must be a string within a minimum length of 5 and maximum length of 50. And as I explained it earlier, you can customize this message as well. And also you can change the color or the style of this message as well with one of the overloaded of this HTML helper. Let's back to Visual Studio to customize the style a little bit. And with this overloaded version, I pass a null for a string message, and here I use HTML attribute, and I use style equal color to red, and save the project. And also I can, as I mentioned, I can customize the message here. For example, for required, I can use error message and set comment is mandatory and keep this message as a default message that it has. Let's save the project and run the project again. Once more, I go to cast strongly typed view and remove the comments value and submit the form, and you can see the style is changed and the custom message is appear here. Or I can add a value less than 5 and you can see the another validation error. And if I add a message here with the range that I need and submit the form, you can see the result, which is submitted data, and it means the model status is valid and it's returned true because the piece of code which is inside the condition that check the model status is running, and I can see the submitted data here. In this session, we review two attributes for form validation, required and string length, and we review the validation message for HTML helper, and also we check how we can use the form validation in custom form and also in the form that I use editor for model. Thank you for being with us. Subscribe our YouTube channel and follow us on our social media. Share your idea with us with the commenting on our website and on this video. Once more, thank you for watching this tutorial.